New York City conjures up images of a neon-drenched Times Square, skyscrapers gleaming in the sun, and the labyrinthine subway system. Yet the city also boasts three main rivers, the Hudson to the west, the East River to the east, unsurprisingly, and the Harlem to the north. Where we find rivers, we can find islands, and where we find islands, we find folklore. New York is no exception. That said, the stories we'll explore this time are far from the druids of Ynys Môn or the megaliths of Menorca. These are stories of people, those arriving, those forced to stay, and those who want to bury treasure. So let's go and explore these stories in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. If I sound a little bit different this week, it's a very, very good reason for that. I broke out with an absolutely horrible cold last week, and yes, it was only a cold. I have been testing, and it's basically gone from my sinuses to my voice. So whether it holds out long enough for recording or not, we shall see. Hopefully it will. But anyway, this is our final trip to islands for folklore this time. I did have a request for Malta, which I will be doing at some point when we come back and revisit islands again next year. There are so many islands to choose from as well, so there's going to be more of them. And this time, though, we are doing New York, because like I said last week, I have had some requests for North American folklore. Now, obviously, there are certain types of North American folklore that obviously are not going to be within my remit, particularly indigenous stories and so on. But obviously for something like New York's folklore in this case, it actually fits in quite well with the sort of stuff, weirdly, that we find in Europe as well. So I hope that this will be helpful. I've never actually been to New York. I'd love to see it, and my brother's been and he loves it. So who knows, at some point maybe I will make it over there to actually have a look at New York myself. But we're going to have a look at three islands. Obviously there's quite a few in and around New York. Obviously, you've got the likes of Staten Island and Long Island, obviously home of the Amityville Horror. But in this particular instance, we're going to have a look at Ellis Island, Liberty Island, and North Brother Island. So they're the ones we're going to be focusing on for running time, and also just because I think that they're slightly more within what it is that we're actually looking for. So we're going to start off with Ellis Island, which is famous as being the immigration point, and it was in operation between 1892 and 1954 and processed over 12 million steamship passengers. An estimated 33 to 40% of Americans have an ancestor who passed through Ellis Island. Its indigenous name was Kiosk, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, or Gull Island. And during the Dutch and English colonial periods, during which obviously the land was appropriated, people called it Oyster Island, thanks to the many oyster beds in the area. At one point, it was actually even called Gibbet Island, because so many gibbets were built to execute criminals or pirates. And yes, we will come back to pirates. But unsurprisingly, Ellis Island has attracted a couple of quite popular myths. And these are myths in the sense that they are popular stories that people continue to believe despite them not actually being based in fact. So the first one is that there's a common misconception that immigration officials would change surnames of incoming people to make them sound more quote-unquote American. Now that is not true, for the simple reason that the officials would ask the immigrants the same questions that the immigrants were asked for the ship's manifest before setting sail. So the officials just wanted to confirm someone's identity and check why they wanted to enter the country. They didn't have time to rewrite people's names and things like that. And as one source pointed out that I looked at, a lot of the people who worked as an immigration official could speak 3 or 4 languages, so they wouldn't really be troubled with different surnames in the way that people assume that they were. So if anyone did change their surname, it was more likely the choice of the immigrant themselves. So you'd often find that people would change their surname to help with pronunciation. Sometimes they would do it to fit in with new neighbours. One example was given of a Polish family who changed their surname because they were living in a Swedish neighbourhood. And either way, officials had nothing to do with the creation of new names. They were literally just there to check the person arriving was the person that was on the ship's manifest. So It's a nice idea, but I actually prefer the idea that the immigrants themselves changed their surnames because it gives them a lot more agency, which I think is a good thing. The other myth, I think, which is probably not as popularly well known, but it's just a common assumption, is actually not everyone travelling from Europe passed through Ellis Island, because it turns out that if you travelled first or second class to New York, the ship would actually stop before Ellis Island and you would disembark and go through a separate immigration facility which processed you because you were wealthy, and it was only steerage passengers that went through Ellis Island. Some stories do refer to very long queues at Ellis Island, and your wait could be anywhere between 3 and 5 hours, depending obviously on how many people were also going through the facility at the same time that you were. You would first answer the clerk's questions about why you wanted to enter the country, and then you saw a doctor. The doctor's examination was actually only around 6 seconds long, although anybody who failed it would attend and sometimes return to Europe. Now this has led to another story that is half true, that the island gained the nickname of the Island of Tears, and this apparently came from the number of people believed to be sent back to Europe. Now, while yes, some families were separated, which obviously would cause a lot of upset, understandably so, only 2% of arrivals were actually sent back. So it's another one of those ideas where the myth and the proportion aren't necessarily quite in any sort of equal measure, shall we say. But that's basically all I could find about Ellis Island. There's lots of really interesting historical sources about Ellis Island, but obviously I was looking for folklore, and that was the closest I could find, and they're listed as legends, so I thought we shall just simply go with that then. But we are going to go on to Liberty Island, and I did promise you treasure, and I did promise you pirates, and Liberty Island has both. And Liberty Island you might understand as being the island where the Statue of Liberty stands. And it was actually originally another of the oyster islands used by the indigenous people in the area. Europeans forced them from the islands, and a Dutch colonist named Isaac Bedloe took over the island in 1667, and it was actually known as Bedloe's Island by about 1673. In 1738, New York City took over the island and turned it into a quarantine station for incoming ships, and it later became a smallpox quarantine station and an asylum during the American Revolution. By 1808, the government started building a fort on the island, which was later called Fort Wood. The army disbanded its garrison there in 1877, and the government identified the site as being ideal for the incoming Statue of Liberty. Obviously, it was actually begun by someone else, but Alexandre Gustave Eiffel ended up working on the project to solve various design and construction issues prompted by the statue's unusual shape. And yes, that is he of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. It's quite interesting actually, because I have seen one of the scaled down versions of the Statue of Liberty outside Colmar in France, and it's fascinating to just occasionally see Lady Liberty just pop up in these other places, and it's still quite impressive, but she's also just stood in the middle of a roundabout, so she doesn't quite have the same majesty that I feel she should have, as obviously she does when she's standing in New York. Very different vibe to the one in Colmar. But the one in New York was finally installed in October 1886, and Bedloe's Island became Liberty Island in 1956, so it did take a while for them to change the name. But well before Lady Liberty took up residence there, the island was associated with buried treasure. And not just any buried treasure, this was Captain Kidd's buried treasure. Captain Kidd, if you're not familiar with him, was born William Kidd in 1645 in Scotland, and he enjoyed a career as both a sailor and a privateer. Obviously, privateers are essentially just state-sponsored pirates as well. Worth putting that out there. And he moved to New York City in his 40s, and after marrying a wealthy widow, he ended up as the owner of an impressive property portfolio. But for whatever reason, in 1695, he took out another privateer's licence and set off to plunder the Indian Ocean. No one knows if he was strapped for cash or just missed his seagoing ways. Now, the trip went wrong for various reasons. I'm not going to go into the details because it's not really important. But the crew mounted a mutiny, and it seems Kidd murdered one of his crew after the crew member urged Kidd to attack a Dutch ship, which Kidd didn't want to do because of the fact that that went against what his licence allowed him to do. And Kidd then ended up stealing a French ship and returned to New York. He was arrested in Boston, but he'd allegedly buried some of his treasure in New York before he was taken to England. He was hanged in 1701 after spending 2 years in Newgate Prison, which obviously I do have an episode about Newgate Prison, but no one has ever found the treasure. There are various different islands which are proposed as being the best candidate as being the particular island, but for some reason people think that Liberty Island is one of them. And in 1830, Sergeant Gibbs and Private Woods hired a psychic to help look for the buried treasure on Liberty Island. They dug up a box, but a winged and horned creature with a tail burst out of the hole, breathing blue flames. The shock caused Gibbs to fall backwards into the water, while his helpers fled. The box vanished and no one has ever found the treasure again. Now, the psychic apparently told them that they needed to find the largest flat rock at midnight on a full moon, armed with a witch hazel divining rod, and that would somehow lead them to the treasure. So other people have tried to repeat those particular instructions, but identifying the particular rock in question has proved more difficult than it sounds. So if there is any buried treasure on the island that somehow hasn't been unearthed by all the construction work, then it would apparently remain there still. But we are going to move on to our final island, which is North Brother Island. And this is part of a pair of islands. You've got North and South Brother Islands in the East River. And they're part of a tidal strait called Hell Gate. And they're actually the product of geological uplift. Claimed by the Dutch West India Company in 1614, South Brother Island is 7 acres and North Brother Island is around 17 acres. Now, North Brother Island is the more interesting of the islands, which is why we're going to focus on it. But it's somewhat notorious in the history of medicine because at one time it housed Riverside Hospital, which sounds quite picturesque, but it was actually a quarantine hospital. So anyone suffering from things like smallpox or tuberculosis could expect to end up there. So too did Mary Mallon, perhaps better known as Typhoid Mary, and her name has gone down in history in the way that real people often become legends, which then obscures the human behind the myth. So sometimes you hear about a person being described as being a Typhoid Mary because of the fact that they're spreading some kind of illness, either intentionally or accidentally, that they carry but that doesn't affect them. And this is essentially an asymptomatic carrier, and Mallon was basically the first one identified, I think pretty much ever, but definitely for something like typhoid. So I think because of the fact that there obviously is all this folklore around the name of Typhoid Mary, I thought, oh, hang on, it'll be quite useful covering her then because she spent so much of her time on North Brother Island. So she was born in 1869 in Cookstown in County Tyrone, Northern Ireland, and she moved to the US in 1884. She made a living as a cook, which was a deeply problematic career choice because it turned out that she was, as I said before, an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever. It's hard to know exactly how many people she infected in her life. Estimates range between 51 and 122 people, and there are 3 confirmed deaths as a result of contact with her. In 1900, typhoid broke out in the house in which she was working as a cook, so she left and took a job elsewhere. Now, the same thing happened, and again she moved on, and Mallon basically made a pattern of this, that she would start working in a house, she would work as the cook, typhoid would break out, and she would leave. And she never left a forwarding address whenever she left a house following an outbreak, which made it quite difficult to find her. But eventually the tendency of leaving as soon as there was an outbreak actually brought her to the attention of investigator George Soper in 1907, and he traced her work history back through 7 different outbreaks to that first one in 1900. Mallon unsurprisingly refused to agree that she was the source, although we do have to remember that asymptomatic carriers were unknown at the turn of the 20th century. She did finally admit that she almost never washed her hands, believing that cooking food was sufficient to make it safe, but because she'd infected so many people already, the authorities placed her under quarantine on North Brother Island. She continued to deny that she was the source of the outbreaks, and official analysis of her samples confirmed that she was riddled with the bacteria, while private samples that she ordered herself suggested she actually tested negative for typhoid fever. But after almost 3 years in quarantine, the New York State Commissioner of Health agreed to let her go as long as she stopped working as a cook and improved her hygiene. Now, Mallon left quarantine in 1910, but by 1915 she'd found difficulties in finding work as anything other than a cook, so she then took a job as a cook at a maternity hospital of all places, leading to another outbreak there. Now, sources suggest that she maintained her innocence about all of this. Mallon was returned to North Brother Island that same year and lived out the rest of her life there. They did give her a private cottage because we do have to remember that North Brother Island and obviously Riverside Hospital itself were actually being used to isolate people with things like smallpox and tuberculosis, which are incredibly contagious. So it was in a way unfair to imprison her on the island with these other people who had these fatal illnesses that she could still contract. But I suppose they tried to get around that particular problem by giving her this cottage that she lived in by herself. She did actually work as a technician for a physician at one point, of preparing slides and things like that. But she died in 1938, aged 69, of pneumonia. Now, historians do debate the ethics of her enforced quarantine, but the story does show the problems caused by poor public health education. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis had proposed germ theory in the 1860s, and then obviously Dr. Joseph Lister expanded upon that in the 1880s, but the general public still knew very little about it by the early 1900s. I would argue people still don't seem to grasp germ theory, despite the fact we've just been through a major pandemic, but that's a side issue. Malin's case did actually help scientists to understand the concept of asymptomatic carriers, although again we can look at the recent pandemic to see how people just can't seem to grasp the concept of them. I do recommend Fever by Mary Beth Keane if you want to learn more about Mary Mallon. It is a really interesting book. It really helped me to understand Mary as a person a lot more, but it is quite interesting to see that behind this somewhat scary name of Typhoid Mary, there was actually a real human being. Her story also demonstrates the crossover that you can sometimes get between the history of a thing, in this case history of medicine, local history, in this case of North Brother Island, but then also folklore as well. So as I say, it's really, really interesting period in history anyway, but it's also a really interesting instalment in the history of medicine as well. Riverside Hospital itself is mostly a ruin now, although it did provide housing for veterans at one point, and it also housed a drug rehabilitation centre until it closed in 1963. But it's not all bad. Black-crowned night herons now use the island as a nesting colony, making the island a bird sanctuary. So it is quite nice to know that life has reappeared among all that death and isolation. And as you might imagine, legends abound that the island is haunted, with screams apparently heard on the deserted island. I don't actually think you can get there without permission now, but a couple of people have posted photos online of what it looks like, and there's a couple of little drone tours that you can watch where you can sort of see what the island looks like without actually disturbing the birds who now call it home, which is quite interesting. But the other thing that North Brother Island appears in, it's not necessarily there as a huge factor in the story, but it is still important to what happened. And this is another case where an incident happened and is sort of now like a bit of a forgotten footnote in history. So it's not part of folklore, but I think it does add to the atmosphere around North Brother Island, and that's the General Slocum disaster. So in June 1904, the General Slocum steamship carried 1,358 passengers plus crew up the East River. St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church had chartered the voyage for $350 for the largely German-American community on the Lower East Side. Most passengers were women and children. The ship caught fire half an hour after it set sail at 9 a.m, and essentially a combination of rotten life vests, rotten lifeboats, non-existent fire drills and an untrained crew led to a disaster. Captain William Henry Van Schaik steered the ship to North Brother Island, but panic had already taken hold and people were essentially torn between trying to get away from the flames and not wanting to jump in the river, because this was also a time when people largely couldn't swim. Because of that, only 321 passengers survived, aided by Riverside Hospital staff, while patients watched in horror from the isolation wards. There are photos online which show victims washed up on the island shore, which obviously I'm not going to reshare. But 1,021 people lost their lives, and up until 9/11, it was the greatest loss of life in one incident in New York. The disaster is a lot less well known now, overshadowed perhaps by the devastating Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in March 1911 and the sinking of the Titanic in April 1912, but many of the local community lost friends and family members who do deserve to be remembered too. So while none of this is folklore and it is really history, I do think that we can also preserve a tale through something like an oral medium like a podcast to help preserve the memory of those involved. And obviously while people in New York might be aware of this, I would imagine a lot of people outside of New York probably aren't, particularly people over here in Europe would be less likely to be aware of such a disaster. So it is worth bearing this in mind, because we are talking about North Brother Island, and obviously it tried to play a role in saving people, and in some cases possibly did for the 321 who survived. And obviously fair play to the Riverside Hospital staff for doing their best to try to help. And what's worse is the fact that the people who caused it were the people who ran the company and they basically walked away scot-free. But at least here we can remember the people who lost their lives. Now, these are just some of New York's islands, like I mentioned at the beginning. Other islands do lie in their rivers, and maybe at some point I will come back and revisit them. I don't know. But I did think it was quite interesting seeing how these ones do have common threads. So we have the common thread of islands being used as quarantine stations, which is quite a logical use for an island. And we see this all over the world, particularly around places like Venice. And there's also that thread of punishment to a degree as well. So obviously you can isolate someone as a form of punishment. And also Rikers Island, which I haven't covered, did hold the prison. So these islands can be used for punishment as well. And also think about Ellis Island being Gibbet Island, where they hung pirates. But I do think of all the stories, my favourite is probably the buried treasure one, because it just kind of stands out as like proper folklore, as it were, among everything else. And I love the idea of these two soldiers essentially hiring a psychic and being like, can you help us find the buried treasure, please? And actually go and looking. And I did think when I read that one, when they were talking about this figure that breathed blue flames, and I'm like, oh my God, could that have been an early spring heel Jack? But I think that's me just trying to draw too many folk legends together and it not really working. But anyway, I did think it was a really cool story. And because it ties into this legendary lost treasure of Captain Kidd, I think, oh, that's definitely worth mentioning. I should also say thank you to Paul, who I know is a listener, who also sent me a ton of history about the other New York islands and just made me want to see more of them. But like I say, obviously, it's trying to find the folklore among the history can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge. But big thank you to him for sending all of that over. That was much appreciated. But anyway, next week we are changing gears to the festive folklore month, and we are going to be doing things slightly differently. And I'm saying we, even though it's just me, but I do have friends this time. So what I'm basically doing is, because I've covered a lot of festive folklore already, and there is an entire playlist for this on YouTube, I was like, I'm not really sure what else I can necessarily cover for Christmas. So I'm going to have guests on to help. So the first episode, I'm speaking to the lawmen. So it's going to be as anarchic and hilarious and silly as you would expect anything involving those two to be. So if you've never heard the Lawmen podcast before, you're in for a treat. If you have, you'll know exactly which way this is going to go. I have actually already recorded the episode with them, and it was such a delight talking to them. They're such wonderful people. So that's coming first. I have also got Sean from the Celtic Myth and Legends podcast. Podcasts are coming on after that to sort of discuss like Christmas traditions and Christmas folklore that they've encountered doing their podcast, so they can bring some additional stuff to the table. My next episode is going to be the Christmas ghost story one, where I've kind of borrowed the idea from the Amicus films, like Dr. Terror's House of Horrors and Torture Garden and stuff like that, where it's like a portmanteau idea, just so I can bring 4 excellent storytellers in to basically bring in some creepy ghost stories. And Owen Staten has already sent me his, and he's managed to hit this balance between creepy and sweet, which I didn't really think would actually ever happen, but it totally does. So you're in for an absolute treat with that one. Not so much for me, I think, but more for the storytellers that I've got who are going to be helping me with that one. And then if everything works out well with timetabling, then I will also have Bethan and Ailsa from Erie, Essex on to talk about New Year folklore. So there's going to be a lot of chatty conversational episodes, not quite in the vein of Fabulous Folklore Presents, although I do have 2 episodes of Fabulous Folklore Presents planned as well. So there's plenty of content for Christmas. So there is festive stuff if you want it. And if you're not interested in the festive stuff, then there are like 300 odd episodes to choose from on the main feed, or you can become a Patreon supporter, and there's over 70 bonus episodes, which largely have absolutely nothing to do with the festive period. So there's tons of content if you want to get away from the rubbish telly that there usually is over Christmas. There you go. I've got you sorted. Anyway, I'll let you crack on now with whatever it is that you're planning to do, mostly because my voice feels like it's about to give way at any moment. So it's been lovely chatting to you as always, and I'll see you next week when I've got some special help from my glamorous assistants, the lawmen. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.